The second point would be that sometimes when racism is discussed, it is thought of as a thing of the past, namely something that occurred between the period in 1933 and 1945, something that was, invented both by the Nazis and then also somehow just collapsed in 1945. Both of these things are obviously very not only offensive but also blatantly untrue, because the first genocide of the 20th century indeed already had forms of racialization. So, the first genocide of the 20th century, which was carried out by the German colonial administration in then German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, where the German colonial administration sought to exterminate the Herero Nama people by brute force, was a case in point in the 20th century of the brutal effects, the deadly effects of racism, where everyday racism, which a lot of activists have often thematized in ongoing discussions, is one level of the racist structures of white supremacy. The sort of height of these structures often ends in genocidal campaigns, as has been the case many times in history. The scholar Sylvia Winter has talked about how 1492 heralds a new era for the majority world, where most of the world is colonized. A lot of the world faces mass extinctions, mass apocalypses, as Nick Estes, the Native American scholar, has called it, and that this era has lasting consequences, not just from the past, but in ongoing campaigns. So whether it is the Dakota Access Pipeline and the resistance to it in what is Turtle Island or North America in its colonial name, or the resistance and campaigns against Shell and other oil companies in Nigeria, or whether it is the exploitation of bauxite and other minerals in indigenous lands in eastern India. All these campaigns have their origins in colonialism, and the ongoing exploitation and the resistance thereto is a case in point for both colonial continuities as well as the continuities of racism and its connection to environmental politics. Now, whiteness is not some essentialist inherent category that exists in certain bodies forever and across all times and regions, but rather we could understand it as a relation to its others, and as a relation which has, as we have already established, deadly consequences for those who are excluded by design from this positionality, right? So whether it is the idea that only white people are allowed in certain areas, as was the case in segregated United States laws, also known as Jim Crow laws, which, by the way, were an inspiration for the National Socialists to implement similar laws and similar forms of segregation and racialized violence. So one might ask the question, how is whiteness relevant to the climate movements? I'm going to sketch out a few ways in which I think the question of whiteness and how white the new climate movements are relevant to concrete praxis in environmental and climate activism. The term Anthropocene, in German Anthropozän. This term seeks to give a name to the current era that we are in, namely following the Industrial Revolution, which took place in Europe in the 19th century, which has heralded a new era which has geological consequences. Whereas earlier eras like the Pleistocene, Holocene, and so on were named after millions of years of geological transformation, the current era, Anthropocene, anthropos in Greek meaning human, is an era that has been heralded by human activity, namely industrial revolution onwards, and so on and so on. So the Anthropocene has been the name given to this era. Now, there are many problems with this framing, as well as with the idea that the Anthropocene should be the name which covers this time period. Firstly, one might argue that it is only a few groups, multinational corporations, and individuals who are responsible for the vast majority of the effects of what we now call the climate crisis. One might argue that it is the fossil fuel companies, the multinational corporations that began, one could argue, with the Spanish and Portuguese colonial conquests and the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and so on. That these companies and the historically colonizing nations that have benefited from the exploitation of vast amounts of the world's human and non-human species, as well as natural resources, are the ones who should be held responsible for the climate crisis, and should be the ones who now pay climate reparations because they have incurred climate debt. There have been many proposals for climate reparations by indigenous groups in Bolivia, for example, by nations on the African continent and in Asia, which have outrightly been rejected more or less by global North nations. In response to this framing of our current era as the Anthropocene, there have been many answers by indigenous and BPOC scholars. For example, Françoise Vergès has suggested that we call the current era the racial capitalocene, which didn't just begin with the Industrial Revolution, which is a sort of Eurocentric view of the world. Rather, it began, as Sylvia Winter and others have argued, in 1492, when the Spanish colonized or began the colonial conquest of the so-called New World, or Turtle Island, as it's known among indigenous folks. And so this was one of the answers which was suggested by scholars and activists